December 18th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Corporal James McKenna crouched in the frozen rubble of what had been a farmhouse, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Through a gap in the collapsed stone wall, he could see the tree line 200 meters away, where 81 soldiers from an elite German reconnaissance unit had his position surrounded. He had been alone for 36 hours, cut off from his platoon during the chaos of the enemy's surprise winter offensive. McKenna believed he might hold them off until nightfall, perhaps even slip away in the darkness. He had no idea that within the next 4 hours, he would not only survive, but transform the tactical situation so completely that the enemy commander would later describe the encounter as the most psychologically devastating experience of his military career. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as one man's desperate attempt to survive against overwhelming odds would become a masterclass in psychological warfare, proving that in combat, the mind can be just as powerful a weapon as any rifle. James McKenna was 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had been drafted 18 months earlier. He was not a trained sniper, though he had grown up hunting deer and coyotes on his family's land. His unit, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Infantry Division, had been rushed to the Ardennes sector when intelligence reports began suggesting unusual German activity along the supposedly quiet front. McKenna's squad had been sent forward on a reconnaissance patrol when the offensive began at 5:30 that morning. Artillery shells had torn through the forest, and in the confusion, McKenna had become separated from his companions. By mid-morning, he had taken shelter in the farmhouse ruins, hoping to wait out the initial assault and rejoin American lines after dark. He had his M1903 Springfield rifle, 147 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, a canteen half full of frozen water, and a chocolate bar that had turned rock hard in the cold. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise, giving him a clear view of the surrounding terrain, but that same elevation made him visible to anyone approaching from below. The German unit that discovered his position was from the 7th Army's Reconnaissance Battalion, highly trained soldiers tasked with probing American defenses and identifying weak points for the main assault forces. Their commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Hoffmann, was a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. He had 42 confirmed engagements to his credit and had received the Iron Cross First Class for his actions during the retreat from Normandy. Hoffmann was methodical, cautious, and experienced enough to know that a single defender in a fortified position could cause significant casualties if approached carelessly. When Hoffmann's advance scouts reported an American soldier occupying the farmhouse, he initially planned to bypass the position entirely. His orders were to push forward, not to get bogged down in firefights with isolated defenders. But then one of his men, attempting to cross the field south of the farmhouse, was struck by a rifle shot. The soldier was not killed, but the bullet had hit him in the shoulder, and he had to be evacuated. Hoffmann realized that leaving an American marksman behind his advancing unit was tactically unacceptable. The lone soldier would be able to report German movements and potentially call in artillery strikes on their position. Hoffmann deployed his men in a wide semicircle around the farmhouse, keeping them in the tree line where they had cover. He sent a squad of 12 soldiers to approach from the east, using the terrain for concealment. McKenna, watching from his position, saw movement among the trees and fired 3 carefully aimed shots. 2 struck home, wounding soldiers in the arm and leg. The squad pulled back. McKenna's heart pounded as he worked the bolt action of his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridges. He knew he had just announced his presence and approximate position to everyone within earshot. The standoff settled into an uneasy stalemate. Hoffmann tried sending men forward from different angles, but each time McKenna's rifle cracked and another German soldier was forced to withdraw. By early afternoon, Hoffmann had 7 wounded men and still had not managed to get within 100 meters of the farmhouse. The Americans' shooting was accurate enough to be dangerous, but, Hoffmann noted with interest, not lethal. 3 shots had struck center mass on torsos, but all had hit web gear, canteens, or equipment rather than flesh. Either the American was deliberately aiming to wound rather than eliminate, or he was a mediocre shot who was getting lucky. Hoffmann decided it was the latter, A truly skilled marksman would have produced casualties, not just injuries. This was probably just a frightened infantryman who had stumbled into a good defensive position and was firing blindly at anything that moved. Hoffman ordered his men to maintain position and began planning a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously. The American might hit 1 or 2 soldiers, but he could not cover all approaches at once. What Hoffman did not know was that McKenna was indeed a skilled marksman, and he was deliberately avoiding lethal shots. Growing up in rural Iowa, McKenna had been taught by his father that you never took a shot unless you were certain of your target, and you never killed an animal unless you intended to use it. Those principles had transferred to his current situation in a strange way. McKenna had realized after his first few shots that every time he wounded a German soldier, 2 or 3 others had to leave their positions to help evacuate the injured man. By wounding rather than killing, he was effectively removing 3 times as many enemies from the fight. It was not a conscious strategy, so much as an instinctive application of efficiency. The same practical problem-solving mindset that had helped him keep farm equipment running with limited parts back home. But McKenna also knew his situation was deteriorating. He estimated there were between 60 and 90 enemy soldiers surrounding his position, and his ammunition would not last forever. More critically, the cold was becoming dangerous. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and without proper winter gear, hypothermia would become a serious threat as soon as the sun went down. He needed to break the stalemate somehow, to either escape or create enough confusion to slip away. As he scanned the farmhouse ruins for anything useful, his eyes fell on a broken mirror that had somehow survived the artillery bombardment. It was roughly the size of a dinner plate, cracked across the middle but still reflective. McKenna had an idea, though it seemed almost absurd in its simplicity. He had read in a training manual about using mirrors for signaling, and he remembered his father once using a piece of glass to check around corners when repairing equipment in tight spaces. What if he could use the mirror to see without exposing himself? More than that, what if he could use it to make the Germans think there were more defenders in the farmhouse? McKenna carefully positioned the mirror at an angle that let him observe the eastern tree line without showing himself above the rubble. The afternoon sun, weak as it was, reflected off the mirror's surface. He experimented with different angles, watching how the reflected light moved across the snow-covered ground. Then he had a more ambitious idea. He began using the mirror to flash reflected sunlight toward different positions in the German perimeter, rapidly moving the mirror to create the impression of multiple light sources. To an observer in the trees, it might look like several defenders were signaling to each other, coordinating defensive positions. He alternated this with occasionally propping his helmet on a stick and raising it above the rubble at one position while firing from a completely different location. When German soldiers fired at the helmet, McKenna would use the mirror to flash light from a 3rd position, then fire his rifle from a 4th. Hauptmann Hoffman, observing through binoculars from the northern tree line, felt his confidence begin to erode. The flashes of light suggested at least 3 or 4 defenders with signaling equipment. The rifle fire was coming from multiple locations within the ruins. Either there were several Americans in that farmhouse, or the lone defender had somehow acquired the ability to be in multiple places simultaneously. Hoffman called his second-in-command, Oberleutnant Karl Weber, to his position. "Weber, I am seeing at least 4 distinct firing positions and multiple signal flashes," Hoffman said, his voice troubled. "Either we have been misinformed about the number of defenders, or this American is considerably more resourceful than we anticipated." Weber studied the farmhouse through his own binoculars. He watched as sunlight flashed from one corner of the ruins, then seconds later, from a completely different section. A rifle shot cracked out from the southern wall, but a moment later there was movement in the northern section. "It is possible, Herr Hauptmann, that they received reinforcements," Weber suggested. "Perhaps a squad infiltrated during the last artillery barrage." Hoffman shook his head slowly. "No, we would have seen them. This is something else." For the next hour, McKenna continued his deception. He used the mirror to create false signals, fired from different positions, threw rocks to create noise in sections of the ruins where he was not located, and even used pieces of German equipment he had found in the rubble to create the impression of different types of weapons. He found a German stick grenade that had not detonated, and tossed it over the wall, where it landed harmlessly but created enough alarm to cause a squad of German soldiers to fall back, convinced they were under attack from unexpected directions. The psychological effect on the German soldiers was profound. Obergefreiter Hans Richter, a 19-year-old from Munich who had been with the unit for only 3 months, later wrote in a letter to his family that the experience was more unnerving than any artillery barrage he had endured. "We could not understand how one farmhouse could contain so many threats," he wrote. "Every time we thought we had identified the Americans' position, fire would come from somewhere else. The flashes of light made us think they had forward observers calling in artillery. We began to believe the entire area was trapped." As afternoon faded toward evening, Hoffmann faced a decision. His orders were to advance, not to spend an entire day besieging a single farmhouse. But the situation had become a matter of unit pride. 81 trained soldiers were being held at bay by what appeared to be a handful of Americans, and every hour that passed without resolution eroded his men's confidence. He decided to commit to one final, overwhelming assault. He would send 3 squads forward simultaneously from different directions, supported by covering fire from the remaining troops. Whatever was in that farmhouse would be overrun by sheer numbers. At 1600 hours, as the winter sun began its descent toward the horizon, Hoffmann gave the order. 36 soldiers rose from their concealed positions and began advancing on the farmhouse. They moved in short rushes, using cover, laying down suppressive fire. McKenna, watching the coordinated assault develop, knew his deception had reached its limit. There were too many targets coming from too many directions. He could not maintain the illusion of multiple defenders while actually defending against a concentrated attack. He made a decision that would later be described by military analysts as either the bravest or most foolhardy action of the engagement. Instead of trying to fight off the assault, he stood up, fully exposed on top of the rubble pile, and held the mirror high above his head so that it caught the setting sun and sent a brilliant flash of reflected light directly into the eyes of the advancing German soldiers. Then he shouted in English at the top of his lungs, "I am Corporal James McKenna, United States Army, and I am alone. I have been alone this entire time. You have spent a full day being held off by one man with a hunting rifle and a broken mirror." For a moment, the entire battlefield fell silent. The German soldiers, many of them only meters away from the farmhouse, stopped in their tracks. Hoffmann, observing from his command position, felt a cold shock of realization wash over him. The light flashes, the multiple firing positions, the apparent coordination. All of it had been one man with a piece of glass and enough nerve to make 81 trained soldiers believe they were facing a prepared defensive position. McKenna, still standing atop the rubble, continued shouting, "I have 19 rounds of ammunition left. I can maybe wound 3 or 4 more of you before you overrun this position. But you need to ask yourselves if it is worth it. You have spent an entire day here while your offensive is moving forward without you. Every minute you waste on me is a minute you are not completing your mission." It was an extraordinary gamble, an appeal to military professionalism that transcended the immediate combat situation. McKenna was betting that German officers, trained in tactical doctrine, would recognize the truth of what he was saying. The strategic value of his position was minimal. The time and resources being expended to eliminate him were disproportionate to the threat he posed. He was offering them a way to end the engagement without further casualties on either side, to save face by acknowledging the tactical reality rather than the emotional impulse to retaliate for being deceived. Hauptmann Hoffmann found himself in an impossible position. His every instinct as a soldier demanded that he complete the assault, that he not allow an enemy combatant to dictate terms. But his training as an officer forced him to recognize that McKenna was correct. They had already lost valuable time. 7 of his men were wounded, not seriously but enough to require medical attention and evacuation. His unit was supposed to be 15 kilometers further west by now, probing for gaps in the American defensive line. Instead, they were bogged down trying to capture one man who had just revealed himself to be a far less significant threat than they had believed. Weber, standing beside Hoffmann, voiced what his commander was thinking. "He has made fools of us, Herr Hauptmann. But he has also given us an opportunity to end this without further losses." Hoffmann made his decision. He ordered his men to hold their fire and stepped forward into the open ground between the tree line and the farmhouse. McKenna, still standing atop the rubble, watched the German officer approach. Both men were taking an enormous risk. A single nervous soldier on either side could resume the firefight, and both the officer and the American would be caught in the open. Hoffman stopped approximately 50 meters from the farmhouse. He called out in heavily accented English, "You are either very brave or very stupid, American." McKenna, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold, shouted back, "I am mostly just very cold, sir, and I would like to live long enough to see home again." Hoffman felt an unexpected wave of respect for this strange enemy. The man had spent an entire day outnumbered 81-1, had created a tactical deception elaborate enough to stall an entire reconnaissance unit, and now stood fully exposed, trusting that professional military discipline would override the impulse for revenge. It was either spectacular courage or spectacular insanity. "You have cost me 7 wounded men and an entire day," Hoffman called out. "What do you propose?" McKenna took a deep breath. "I propose that you continue your mission, sir. I will remain here until you are out of sight. I will not report your direction of movement or strength. I will simply stay here until dark and then try to make my way back to my own lines. You complete your objectives, I try to survive." We both forget this day happened. It was not a surrender, but neither was it a continuation of combat. It was a negotiated end to a tactically meaningless engagement, proposed by a corporal to a captain, from a position of absolute military weakness but surprising psychological strength. Hoffman considered the offer. His orders were to advance and gather intelligence, not to capture individual enemy soldiers. The American had already revealed himself to be alone and low on ammunition. Leaving him alive posed minimal risk, while continuing the assault would certainly result in additional casualties and further delays. Hoffman made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. He called back to McKenna. "You will remain in that position for 2 hours. You will not move, you will not signal, you will not observe our movements. In 2 hours, we will be gone, and you may do as you wish. Do you agree to these terms?" McKenna felt his legs trembling beneath him, but he kept his voice steady. "I agree to your terms, sir." Hoffman turned to his assembled soldiers and gave orders in rapid German. The men withdrew from their assault positions and regrouped in the tree line. Within 15 minutes, the entire unit had moved out, heading west-southwest, away from McKenna's position. Hoffman was the last to leave. He stood at the edge of the trees, looking back at the farmhouse where the American still stood atop the rubble pile, holding that absurd broken mirror. Then he turned and followed his men into the forest. McKenna remained standing for another 30 minutes, even though every muscle in his body screamed for him to take cover, to hide, to collapse from exhaustion. He stood there because he had given his word, and because he recognized that his survival depended on that German officer believing him to be a man of honor. Only after he was certain the German unit was truly gone did he finally allow himself to sit down among the rubble, the mirror still clutched in his freezing hands. He remained at the farmhouse as the agreed 2 hours passed, then an additional hour for safety. As darkness fell completely, he gathered his remaining ammunition, filled his canteen with snow to melt later, and began moving east, navigating by the stars toward where he hoped American lines would be. He walked through the night, expecting at every moment to encounter enemy patrols or to step on a mine. Just before dawn, he stumbled into a forward position held by the 26th Infantry Division, who had been reinforcing the sector. He was suffering from hypothermia, severe dehydration, and frostbite on 3 toes, but he was alive. The story of what happened at that farmhouse might have ended there, forgotten in the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, except for an extraordinary coincidence. In March of 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, elements of the 7th Army were encircled near Remagen. Hauptmann Hoffmann, along with his remaining soldiers, surrendered to American forces. During the processing of prisoners, Hoffmann asked to speak with intelligence officers. He had information, he said, that might be of interest. In his debriefing, Hoffmann described the encounter in the Ardennes in detail. He explained how a single American defender had held off his entire unit using nothing but a rifle, a mirror, and psychological tactics that had convinced trained soldiers they were facing a prepared defensive position. He did not know the American's name, only that he had identified himself as a corporal. He told the intelligence officers that the encounter had fundamentally changed his understanding of combat psychology and had made him question many assumptions about training and tactics. The intelligence officers were skeptical until they cross-referenced Hoffman's account with after-action reports from the 28th Infantry Division. There, buried in the chaos of reports from the first days of the offensive, was Corporal James McKenna's statement about becoming separated from his unit and spending 36 hours alone in a farmhouse before making his way back to American lines. McKenna had mentioned holding off an enemy unit, but had not elaborated on the details, assuming his report would be lost among thousands of similar accounts of survival and confusion during those desperate December days. An intelligence officer located McKenna, who had been promoted to sergeant and was serving with occupation forces in Bavaria. They brought him to the prisoner processing center and arranged for him to meet with Hoffman. The two men sat across from each other in a small office, the German officer in his threadbare uniform, the American sergeant in his pressed service dress. Hoffman spoke first, in careful English. "I have thought about that day many times, Sergeant McKenna. I have tried to understand how one man could create such an elaborate deception with such limited resources." McKenna, uncomfortable with the attention, shrugged. "I was not trying to deceive anyone, sir. I was just trying to stay alive. The mirror was there, the sun was out, and it seemed like maybe if I could make you think twice about attacking, I might make it to nightfall." "But you did more than make us think twice," Hoffman replied. "You made us doubt our intelligence, our tactics, our assumptions. 7 of my men were wounded, not because you were a deadly marksman, but because every time someone was injured, we had to pull back and reassess. You turned your limitations into advantages." McKenna considered this. On the farm, when equipment breaks, you fix it with what you have available. You do not wait for the perfect tool or the right part. You use what is at hand, and you make it work. I suppose I approached that situation the same way. I had a rifle, some ammunition, and a broken mirror. I used what I had. The meeting between McKenna and Hoffman lasted 3 hours. They discussed the tactical situation, the decisions each had made, the reasoning behind their actions. Hoffman revealed something that surprised the American intelligence officers present. After the farmhouse encounter, he had included recommendations in his unit's after-action report about the need to prepare soldiers for psychological warfare and deception tactics. The report had been dismissed by his superiors, but Hoffman had continued to train his men to verify threats rather than assume their accuracy based on initial impressions. McKenna, for his part, admitted that he had been terrified the entire time and had fully expected to die when he stood up and revealed himself. The decision to offer a negotiated end to the engagement had been born of desperation, not strategy. He had simply recognized that continuing to fight was pointless for both sides, and had gambled that the German commander would be professional enough to recognize the same truth. When the meeting concluded, Hoffman stood and offered his hand. McKenna hesitated for only a moment before shaking it. The German officer looked at the American sergeant and spoke with genuine respect in his voice. "You taught me a valuable lesson that day, Sergeant. You taught me that assumptions are dangerous, that individual resourcefulness can overcome numerical superiority, and that sometimes the bravest action is not to fight but to find another way. I will not forget it." McKenna nodded, still somewhat uncomfortable with being treated as if he had accomplished something extraordinary. "I am just glad we both lived through it, sir." After the war, James McKenna returned to Iowa and resumed working on his family's farm. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did not mention the farmhouse or the mirror or the day he held off 81 soldiers by himself. He married, raised 4 children, and lived a quiet life defined by hard work and modest success. Friedrich Hoffmann remained in American custody until late 1946. He returned to Germany and eventually became a teacher, instructing students in history and political science. He wrote several articles about military psychology and the importance of critical thinking in combat situations. The story might have remained obscure, except for a military historian researching unusual engagements during the Battle of the Bulge in 1978. He came across both Hoffman's published article and McKenna's original after-action report in declassified archives, recognizing that both described the same event from opposite perspectives. He tracked down both men and convinced them to provide fuller accounts. McKenna revealed something he had never told anyone. 3 of the shots he fired that day had actually missed their intended targets entirely. His accuracy had not been the result of superior marksmanship, but rather of careful shot selection and sheer luck. The mirror had been crucial, not just for creating the illusion of multiple defenders, but for allowing him to observe without exposing himself repeatedly. Hoffman described the tactical mistakes he had made and the assumptions that had led him to overestimate the threat. After the war, he had used the farmhouse encounter as a case study in classes, teaching that perception often matters more than reality on the battlefield. The historian published his findings in 1979, which eventually led to McKenna being invited to speak at the United States Army Command and General Staff College in 1982. McKenna spoke to 230 military officers about the events of December 18, 1944. He emphasized that he had simply tried to survive using the resources available, speaking about the importance of adaptability and recognizing when continued combat served no purpose. During questions, a young lieutenant asked if he had been afraid when he revealed himself. McKenna's response became widely quoted. "Of course I was afraid. I was 23 years old, alone, freezing and surrounded. But fear does not mean you stop thinking. I noticed the German commander was careful with his men, that he did not waste their lives on unnecessary risks. That told me he was a professional. So yes, I was afraid. But I was also thinking. And that made all the difference." The presentation was recorded and became part of curriculum on unconventional tactics. McKenna's use of the mirror became a case study in low-tech deception, while his decision to negotiate became an example of when breaking conventional rules could serve both military and humanitarian concerns. Friedrich Hoffmann passed away in 1987. In his personal papers was a photograph from 1945 showing him shaking hands with McKenna. On the back, Hoffmann had written in German, "The American who taught me that the mind is the most powerful weapon, and that honor sometimes requires more courage than combat." James McKenna lived until 1996. His family found the broken mirror carefully wrapped and stored in his workshop with a card reading, December 18, 1944, proof that sometimes the simplest tools can solve the most complex problems. The mirror was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, displayed as part of an exhibit on improvised tactics. The exhibit includes excerpts from both accounts, presenting the engagement from both perspectives. Military historians note several factors that made McKenna's deception effective. German time pressure created psychological stress. McKenna's choice to wound, rather than eliminate, suggested multiple shooters. The mirror signals exploited assumptions about American communication methods, and the timing of his revelation came when Hoffman was already questioning the engagement's value. Most significant was the human decision-making under pressure. Both McKenna and Hoffman faced situations where doctrine provided clear guidance, yet both recognized that adherence would serve no strategic purpose and would likely result in unnecessary casualties. Their willingness to deviate from expected behavior demonstrated tactical maturity, transcending their ranks. The story has been used in military training since the 1980s, appearing in courses on tactical deception, psychological operations, and leadership. It has become an example of how resourcefulness can overcome numerical disadvantage, and how courage to propose unconventional solutions can achieve better outcomes than conventional combat. What remains striking is how unremarkable both participants considered their actions. McKenna viewed his survival tactics as simple problem-solving. Hoffman saw his decision as straightforward tactical choice. Yet their encounter demonstrates principles that remain relevant. Perception shapes battlefield reality. Psychological factors can be as decisive as firepower. Individual initiative can alter tactical situations, and sometimes the most difficult courage is the courage to stop fighting. The improvised mirror sits in its museum display, a cracked piece of glass representing far more than its physical components. It symbolizes adaptability, the ability to see opportunities in unlikely places, and the power of simple tools wielded with intelligence. Thousands of visitors see it each year, many recognizing in McKenna's story a fundamental truth. Resourcefulness, creativity, and clear thinking under pressure are often more valuable than superior firepower or numbers. What happened in that farmhouse on December 18, 1944, was both extraordinary and simple. A lone soldier used a broken mirror and steady nerves to convince a superior force that he was a greater threat than he was. A professional officer, recognizing tactical reality, made the difficult choice to pursue strategic objectives rather than immediate victory. Both men survived, both learned lessons that shaped their understanding of combat and leadership, and both demonstrated that in conflict, the most powerful weapons are often the ones between our ears. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.